It's with great pleasure that I present to you our last speaker for the day. This is Peter London, and some of you may have already been introduced to some of his readings with his books that are currently out. No more secondhand art. All of a sudden, I thought that was like the second line. It's no more secondhand art, and then a second book called Community-Based Art Education. A third book called Drawing Closer to Nature. And we were very happy a few years ago to have Peter in residence with us for an entire year. He met monthly with faculty and students and alumni, and we organized a very nice alumni study group to see how we might make practice in the K-12 years more holistic in its approach. And so what I'd like to ask Peter to do is to, since he's a major voice for a holistic approach to start education, to tell us a little bit about what that might mean and how that might in fact allow us to deliver on the possibilities that come with us as human beings. So with that introduction, Peter, it's your turn. Welcome, Peter, please.
Hello. Excuse me. So I'm the last in this fabulous relay race. Having heard everybody, I guess, but Dave, because I was still flying in at that time, I feel almost like the relay races in the Olympics, the last American female race, and the next to the last gal started before the final runner. And so I'm feeling that the last presentation of Jan's was so well made, so intelligent, so useful, so well wrought, that I'm not so sure that she's passed the baton to me. To make sure that she has, however, I'm going to read her story again because it was so good, but it does lead into what I do want to say. She said this: "It's my personal belief, and it is also my personal belief, that one of the most important purposes of art is to tell a story. To tell one story and to share one's interests and concerns, one's personal view of the world, one's joys and sorrows in order to touch the life of another, in my opinion," she says, and it is mine too, "is the primary purpose of art. The vast majority of art relates to story, either in and of itself or relates in some way to the individual artist's life and is therefore a part of the artist's personal narrative." I fully embrace that point of view, and Jan and I have spoken about this a bit before. I would amend that only slightly, perhaps more in language and emphasis than what Jan herself said. And that is that everybody has their story to tell. And the difference between a story and their story makes a tremendous difference in every possible way and leads into a holistic approach that I'll be speaking about. If it's a story, then it is just part of an infinite number of stories, not one of which is necessarily true and compelling. But when one speaks about their own story, then immediately one steps from and the objective and the neutral party to the universe's sole expert on the issue. And when one steps from what one has heard to what one is, the authority from which one speaks, the depth of that, your possible kind of inquiry into that, no less the interest in others in your story, is profound. you may know that the whole purpose of all the speaking therapies, psychotherapy, is to get the person into an environment in which they finally feel safe enough, revealing enough, and ultimately concerned enough to go from the usual chatter of this is another story to finally making an account, saying nothing more and nothing less than this is my life and how it feels to be me. It turns out that the mere, but not so mere, but the fact of being able to make an account of your life to someone who will listen to you as long as you wish to speak, and wherever you go with that story, is a healing phenomena. And as it heals, it empowers. And as it heals, it empowers, it clarifies and deepens the wisdom and authority with which one speaks about, therefore, subsequently, anything else. Does that make sense? So when Jan says the importance of narrative is a primary importance to art, of course it is. And it is also the primary importance of life. That is, isn't that what you want in a mate, in a parent, in a lover, in a good companion, in a colleague, somebody who's trustworthy, who you can say something honestly about yourself to, and they won't blanch, they won't run away, they'll be interested until you finish your story? Not necessarily that they have to then instruct you or judge you or shape you subsequently, but merely, but primarily, to listen to you as you complete your tale. Completing your tale is like completing your life. The importance of art for artists is, in fact, that art does complete one's life. It takes all the infinite impressions that come to you from the world and makes an order out of it, makes it, in fact, a story, has a plausibility to it, has a reasonableness to it. Therefore, you become reasonable. Therefore, you become plausible. Therefore, your pains and your sorrows and your joys and your triumphs are reasonable things for you to have. So you enter yourself more legitimately. Isn't that so? So interestingly, some people ask me, well, what's the difference between art as art and art as therapy? Good art and good therapy really are sisters to one another in that same way. They complete the necessity, that human necessity there seems to be, of making from the plethora of events of our life a coherent, plausible legitimacy, therefore, us. And that the images that we make along the line are records, they're mirrors and windows that reflect, in fact, and reveal, in fact, this life that we have. So, everybody has a story to tell, and it is their story. But supposing the atmosphere with which we mostly live our lives is not congenial for us to tell that story. And so, like almost all of us, we live out our lives with not telling that full story. That's a rough way to go through it, and an incomplete way to finish off a life. My contention is this, and it's not only my contention, but this. Supposing the social environment that we are almost entirely encompassed by is in fact not congenial for us to tell our story. It's not safe enough. It's not inviting enough. It's not nurturing enough. It's not patient enough. It's not interested in us sufficiently for us to tell our story. It's constantly telling us of its story and their story, and it's constantly shaping us. But it doesn't open up a septum large enough for, in fact, us to appear, but rather for the legacy to pour over us and for us to become it or them or other. In other words, supposing who we actually are is less than, weaker than, and a distorted version of the actual people and society of people that we might be. Jean Houston, some years ago, wrote a wonderful book, or the most provocative title, called The Possible Human. And I love that idea. And she says, as I say now, and lots of other people have too, just because we live in the same atmosphere that everybody else lives in, and therefore behave in the normative way that we mostly all do, it doesn't mean at all that that atmosphere is the most nutritious and congenial one for our becoming. And as a consequence, us and the people that we meet in covenant with are also less and distorted and clouded and diluted from the persons that they might be. It's possible. And just because we all breathe the same atmosphere and all talk the same talk, relate to each other in the same way, we take that normative as being normal or natural. But it's just as likely, if one steps away from this society and looks at it as a cultural anthropologist might, that in fact we have habits of mind and habits of social graces and interactions and expectations and language systems, which in fact is suffocating and obscuring the persons that we actually are. It could be possible. So, where does that lead us to now? A holistic vision of things. A holistic vision of things says this: it seeks the possible human within every human. It says, it proposes or just describes several most obvious elements. The first is that human beings are an amalgam of mind and body and spirit. And only when all three of those characteristics, deeply, fundamentally made characteristics of the human being, are addressed, are honored, are called forward, and nurtured, that when those three elements of the self are brought up and forward and cultivated, interestingly, the person who is addressed and cared for in that way automatically shifts their behaviors to be more loving, more compassionate, even wiser, certainly more intelligent, and a sense of greater grace and well-being. Sounds like a high proposition, but think of falling in love, especially kind of new love. I hope you've all had that time. And it may be just with you and a parent, you with a friend, you with a mate, or whomever it is. When you're in the company of somebody who really loves you, don't you feel smarter? Am I not right? And don't you actually say things that are even more wise and insightful? You even astonish yourself. And don't you even talk nicer? Isn't there a kind of a poetry, a deep kind of rhythmic character to what you say? A musicality to it in its phrasing? Don't you want to pick flowers and give them to not only your loved one, but to anybody who passes on the street? Don't you want to just, oh, you're so pretty, oh, you're so beautiful, here, take this, take that. It's a very interesting thing about being in love. There is a generosity you want to give to the world. There's this kind of empathic and compassionate regard. You speak and you act more gracefully. You're more indefatigable. All sorts of things. Your appetite increases, doesn't it? And your acuity of senses do too. You're more lofty in your visions of things instead of preoccupied with self. I do hope you've had somebody to love in that way, even if it was just for a little while, or whoever it is. But see if I'm not describing new love or wonderful love. And it could be with a grandparent that you haven't seen for a while, that you come back to, or a dear friend, whatever the thing is. You can compare that to the company of someone who you think or thinks poorly of you. Don't you get stupider right away? I don't know what to say. And you're not clever, you're not that usual fabulous witty self, you don't have anything cute to say or funny to say. You stop seeing things, you stop hearing things. You don't want to give anything away, you're sheltered, you're inward in that kind of fashion. Am I not right with that? Or maybe you're more generous than I. So it's a very interesting kind of thing then. That Marion said something interesting too when she set up her talk. She raised the question, does instruction matter? And she demonstrated that, of course, it does fabulously. Jan spoke of the same thing, and you saw the results of that methodical, fabulous instruction she gave there. What I'm saying is, if instruction matters, and instruction is only a facet of environment, shouldn't environment matter too? But because environment is so encompassing, we don't see its edges, we don't see its boundaries, we don't see and notice its effect, because it's affecting us simultaneously as it is everybody else. And we just say it, that's nature, that's human nature, that's the way it is, that's school, that's a teacher. It isn't school, it isn't teachers, it isn't environment, it isn't good, it isn't bad. It is the way we happen to be in this historical, but a long, long way, historical period of time. So the holistic approach to education, arts education and every other education, is to say, let's step back from a moment from instruction. And let's take the first element, and that is environment and setting. And let's be instructed from love and hate. Why not? It's the major feature of our lives. It's the major compass that we go to or flee from. And let's see what there is in that loving relationship as compared to the non-loving relationship, and see if we can construct an educational environment which mirrors that of a loving relationship. And let's see what happens. Well, one of the things about this environment is that it's congenial, it's welcoming to the whole human being, mind, body, and spirit. I'll start with mind, because that's most familiar with us. Schools, for better or for worse, are the home of mind. But unfortunately, what's conventionally taken to be mind, relative to schools, is the rational mind. But in fact, our minds are capable of a great deal more than that. We have intuitions, we have imagination, we have fantasies, we have dreams, we have passions, we have subconscious, and we have consciousness as well. And the notion of a holistic proposition is, unless the entirety of the element is considered, invited, and nurtured, those elements which are not considered will defeat and diminish and distort those which are being attended to. Too bad. So if the schools, and they do, primarily work only with the cognitive domain, and you can get very clever because we are capable of being trainable to anything. Think of the Holocaust. Humans can be trained to do anything. That's not a trick. But if that training in one domain isn't also supported mutually by those other domains of mind, intuition, imagination, subconscious, superconscious as well, then all those other mindfulnesses know something and different from the conscious mind, and therefore will cast its shadow of doubt on what the conscious mind itself knows, and therefore diminish even the cognitive capacity of mind. So the effective teacher, especially in art, or the arts, who doesn't weave into the common discourse of the day and the lesson intuitions, imagination, dream type of information, hopes, fears, subconscious material, as well as cognitive material, doesn't create a strong enough, formidable enough, sturdy enough, even intellectual atmosphere to really do what, in fact, Marion was, I think, pointing out is, and that is, what is the carryover of instruction? I would say one of the reasons why there is this vast falling off of performance from instruction to subsequent performance is, not only isn't there continued tutoring of the thing, lifting it up, but it could very well be that all of these other mindfulnesses is saying, we don't have any information about that. You haven't called on our hand. We know things too. Wouldn't that make a fuller, richer vision of the world and a steering through it than just this other one information? So whenever the being doesn't have all the critical information in order to go forward, it goes slowly. Fortunately, we have those breaks. And it just may well be that our whole society is going as slow and as tepidly and as timidly and as conservatively and as jealously and as greedily as it does. It's because the whole corpus of mindfulness is not being attended to, not being cultivated, and not marching in a coherent way. Does that make sense? So I think I'm saying something not in contrary to Marion or Jan or to the other speakers, or Sandy and David. But I'm saying something about this encompassing atmosphere within which all of the, I think, marvelous strategies and interventions and insights that you have been hearing today can move more fully forward with. Well, that's the things about the mind. Let's talk about body. In fact, I was speaking with Schuyler a little while ago. I see art, the making of art, as a dance. There's certainly a physiological component to every gestural element. Dancers know that. Athletes know that. People in theater know that. Well, the musicians know that. How is it that in the visual arts we haven't taken seriously the physical body as a tunable instrument through which you express yourself? The first instrument is ourself. How is it possible to have an entire arts education without speaking about and cultivating breathing, for instance? Impossible for an artist who is a dancer, a musician, an athlete. Impossible. But we do physiological things. How is posture not expressed? How is agility, fluidity, strength not addressed in the visual arts? It's an amazing thing to me that you could have a foundations program or an arts program and not have an iota of any of cultivation of the body as the first instrument of expression. And we don't. Have you? I've never seen one thing in a curriculum, or even extracurricular except sports, in any school of art. Well, in holistic notions, there is this primary one too, and that is there is a mind-body connection. The mind, in fact, is encapsulated in stone called Ukrainium. It gets no primary information. All of the information that your brain receives is mitigated through your body, unless you happen to have a brain with no skull. All of the information comes through your eyes and your ears and your nose and your mouth and through your skin and through all of the agencies of that. So, what the brain knows about its well-being comes to it through the agency of the body. And what the body expresses, of course, is what the mind's opinion is of the body in the world. That connection between mind and body is perhaps the most ancient observation of human beings and began all of healing, all of medicine, all of shamanic work, all of just simply, once again, a loving, intimate relationship. So not to cultivate a concurrent education in the body, in its gracefulness, in its coherence, in its endurance, in its flexibility, in its virtuosity, in its dexterity, in its fine and large motor coordination, in its sense of expansiveness, in its sense of safety, all of those things, which are so supportive of every gestural act subsequently on a page or on a piece of clay, is the strangest thing. Not only that, a moment ago I said that if the panoply of agencies of the mind are not all cultivated, and there is dissonance between what the conscious mind knows and the subconscious mind knows, if there's dissonance between those two, there'll be a dropping of effectiveness in both. then the conscious mind will doubt the agency of the subconscious, and the subconscious will worm its way and make for doubt and anxiety in the conscious mind. I said that before about mind. The same thing is true about body and mind. If the body doesn't feel safe and able and agile and welcome just as it is, then it will inhibit the behaviors of the body in the world. And when you talk about behaviors, you're talking about the marks we make in the world: social, verbal, and physical art. The last agency that I'll speak of is this spirit, mind, body, spirit. For a number of reasons, not the least of which is a kind of a religious fervor that sometimes shivers up and down the American personality. We've allowed religions to excise from education matters of the spirit. A profound loss that I can't imagine intelligent and mindful people have allowed. That and the notion of historical separation of church and state. Church has been equated with religion, and religion with religious, and religious with spiritual, when in fact they're 5 independent words, meaning 5 independent elements. They could be joined together. But for spirit, I simply mean this: the spiritual. The spiritual is that which lies at the essential core of your value system. Let's just call it that. You don't have to have a God in that if you don't want to. You don't have to have ritual in that. And you don't have to have any dogma at all in that. Just the idea that those things, ideas that are most precious to you, let's call that the spiritual domain. I've looked at a lot of art in a lot of art education programs, K through 12 and then on to higher education. And it is a very rare occasion where I have heard motivations and lessons dealing with the core value system of the student. There may be some, and there may be here, and maybe this is the great school that's an exception to it. But for the most part, what people are asked to do is things about the world, or anecdotes about themselves, sometimes. But for the most part, it's the methods and the materials of making handsome things well. It's rare that people are asked the core existential questions. What's important to you? What lies at the center of your being? What's the last thing that you would be willing to discard? What's the first thing that you would embrace? Questions like that. And so the notion here is that, and it's only those things, that last category, things of the spirit, meaning that which lies closest to your central value system, that you have really any expertise about at all. These are the only original things that you ever have. You don't have language, right? Everybody just speaks what they were taught to speak, and you dress what there is to wear, sometimes less. And you think lots of other things are good and bad, mostly because of the information coming to you. But that which you value can be considered that which is utterly, thoroughly your own. That you can say, I know this to be so. However cockeyed that may be, that doesn't matter. But this is your your original take on the world. When that isn't the subject of your instruction, of art, then you're always again working outside of your domain of really confident knowledge. And so education is something that washes over you rather than you being the author of. Everything that washes over you, you don't really know, and you know you don't really know. Only those things that you have concluded are your own. That's the real substance of art. That's what artists claw towards all of their careers as artists, is to get to that thing which is finally and ultimately, this is where I am. And this is how things look and feel to me. So, a holistic education in art, or for that matter, any other thing, is an education that invites, cultivates, shares and celebrates that wide panoply of characteristics of mindfulnesses, body, and spirit. And just as one almost automatically transforms oneself without further instruction when one falls in love into this finer, smarter, more decent, more caring, more patient, more deliberate, more clever and even witty self when one falls in love, it's been my experience, again, not only my own, but the people who work with me, that when a teacher creates in their classroom these environmental elements, the whole group of people within it, the whole community of participants, rise up without further instruction to in fact be more graceful, more forthcoming, more engaged, more focused, more elaborating, more penetrating than before. And if you then add to that instruction, yowie, it's quite incredible. But if you don't do that, and you just simply take the child as they bumble into the class, beat up as they are in the halls, and the classroom, the standardized classroom, as the benign place that we mostly think it as to be, then you are working to pour instruction down through layers of suffocating murk. Now, when I say that, I realize that you are an elect few here. You've already made it through. You're the smart people. You're the people, as bruised as you might have been, who made it through school. But for every one of you, you know, there are dozens who didn't make it through school, who suffered even more so than you did. So in some way, I'm talking to people for whom the atmosphere of school is not as antithetical to well-being as many others. But it's those many others that you will teach when you are in school. One is this, that they immediately feel, with no contingencies, welcome and accepted just the way they are. It sounds rather neutral, because if you accept the person just the way they are, won't they just stay the way they are forever? Which is the fear that every teacher and parent has. If I don't constantly feed this kid, she'll die. She won't eat. She won't know what. Or dress her. She'll go out naked. Or cross the street and get killed by the first thing. And it turns out there's a very interesting paradox. That accepting a person just the way they are in their initial behavior sets the stage opens up the septum for the person to step forward into their agenda of becoming. But if you set the agenda too quickly for them, there's no opportunity for that to happen. There's a corollary to that that is important to say. And it's a belief system that, again, is from my experience. I have never met a person who wants to be exactly and only who they presently find themselves to be. Every person that I have had the good fortune to meet, even the worst of the kinds, wants to be better and less painful than where they are. No one wants to be stupider. No one wants to be weaker. No one wants to be more disgusting. No one wants to be unwittier than they presently find themselves. Everybody wants to be better. Or maybe this will be the first time. Would you raise your hand if you want to be worse than you find yourself to be today? Jan had a little survey. I thought I'd make a survey myself. The finishing of that idea is that not only does everyone want to be more and different than they are, it's invariably an elevated one. Everybody, in fact, wants to be more lovable and more loving than they can find themselves to be at the moment. Everybody wants to be smarter and wiser. Everybody wants to be more agile and knowledgeable. Everybody wants to be liked more. Everybody wants to be more giving than they find themselves able to or in possession of at the moment. So, interestingly, if I do accept a person just as they are, as they enter, and taking off my particular agenda for them to be cleverer, to be better artists, to be anything else, to teach them anything, just opening that up, that welcoming thing, then the energy that they have used to be your servant of your agenda and your curriculum and your purpose for them can become more articulate, come more forward, and find its possible expression. Teachers don't like to hear that, especially teachers today that come in with imposed curriculum, imposed frameworks and standards, imposed outcomes-based testing, high stakes. And so the child, as they burrow their way through school, knows that they're going to have to satisfy many people's agenda. And what I'm saying is just the opposite. We will never come to know their agenda. We will never come to know their full genius of possibilities. We'll never know their color and the wisdom possible if we impose our system of what we want and what we value too soon. So, the premise again of a holistic education is the human being is a dynamic creature on the way to becoming the person they always preferred to be, rather than the historic creature they have had to be as a consequence of their history. So that's the first one. The second atmospheric element, which would enhance subsequent instruction, is this: that every person is equally worthy of consideration, of serious consideration. And by that I mean just simply listening and looking at a person as if they count. That hasn't happened to me very often when I went through school K through 12. And I have found that just that element alone, listening to a person until they finish speaking, makes them, if you as a human being, a superhuman being like a teacher, can take them serious, then maybe what they have just said or what they are is serious. So then they start thinking seriously about themselves just by your taking them seriously. You see how each one of these things are kind of refractory in that kind of way? The third element is safe from disabling judgment and ridicule. With high stakes testing and the sense of accountability pouring into schools through the doors and through the windows, schools become a very unsafe place to be. Especially because the school is a place where novel ideas are also pouring through. You have novel ideas where kids don't know anything about, endlessly being asked of them, and then the other window pouring in assessment about how did you do. Two currents which cause a maelstrom of anxiety and reduces performance. So, there's a lot more to say about assessment and evaluation and so on. But unless a person feels safe, especially initially, from judgment at all, disabling judgments subsequently, and certainly free from ridicule, they will step back and perform at their safest, most rudimentary level of survival. You do it. And every child does too. So if you really want peak performance, in fact, you have to do almost something opposite to what educational reforms in this deeply conservative moment in American history is asking for us, and that is have no judgment initially. Try it out. Play with that. You can't play when somebody is judging you. It's like making love when somebody's scoring you. Well, let's see now. It isn't easy. The same thing is true with any intellectual act as it is physical, as it is a spiritual act. So, the next one is this, that each person is seen and treated as capable of infinite possibilities. That means, I know we've been speaking about developmental work here, and that there's a sequence of things that go on. And over time, and in general ways, that's true. But this truth says something different. This truth says, you never know, and never can know, the person in front of you. They are infinitely capable of surprise, as you are, and allow them to be that way. Your expectation shapes and modifies and confines their behavior. Now, a lot of that is called instruction, and instruction it is indeed. But there must be time for the unpredictable person to appear before you. And no matter how many times that kid has been one sweet pain in the ass, forgetting this, dropping this, stealing that, if you look at them the next day as a thief and as clumsy and as forgetful, they'll fulfill your expectation of them. And they will then call themselves that. And they'll bring that to the next time. But if you remain constantly curious and constantly interested in the infinite possibility of their becoming, and though patterns can be observed, the future cannot be predicted, then you allow their spontaneous self, their intuitive self, their playful, their imaginative, their risk-taking self to leap forward. And doesn't that sound like art, the best art, too? And isn't that the best kind of relationship with somebody that you have? Of course, it's nice to come home for dinner, and there is a home, and there is dinner, and there is somebody to come home to. So we're not talking about just simply a spontaneous life of giddiness, but there must be this and there must be that. And there's precious little of that, that is, the spontaneity involved. Does that make sense? Also, by understanding that notion of seen and created as of infinite possibilities, you allow the person not to be only the momentum of their history, but that they can actually transform themselves in the new way, almost spontaneously, in the direction of their desire. Otherwise, they wag the history of themselves, and it becomes, again, a self-fulfilling notion. Another element is a member of a mutually respecting community of learners, in which each person has something of value to offer, and each person has something important to receive. That is, to build into what you teach and how you teach and how you speak with people the responsibility, not only the invitation, to teach what you know to someone else at some point else. It must be somehow imbued with people. Not only do they have a thirst of knowing something that they don't know, but within their personal history resides significant and unique information that is of value and that other people can benefit from. That kind of, again, mutuality is an empowering notion. Can you understand that? If I'm only on the receiving end, I build my life as simply this vessel to take in, and that I know, deeply know, that I am incomplete without constantly being informed by and being enriched by someone else. It's the perpetual hollowness that many people feel, and therefore the dependency that plays its way out in all kinds of human and intellectual and social human relations. So unless there's the cultivation of residing knowledge based upon experience as it is, there's no sense of self-sufficiency that is the corresponding complement to eagerness to learn. Does that make sense? Finally, and here's where I'll end the element that I began with. And that is that a person is lovable. There's a term, too, that has been extirpated from the literature of education, even art education, who seems to be dashing madly to catch up with what education is no longer interested 10 years ago. Fascinating how we do that. But here's the central feature of human life, love, and wanting to be loved and feeling lovable. It's the most enabling and the most disabling state of mind to be. All kinds of love, not only eros, but agape and all other elements too. How could an education at all, no less an education through and in the arts, not cultivate this dimension in a conspicuous kind of way of being lovable and all of the skills that that requires, and being loving and all of the skills that that requires? I guess you can be a crumb, a little shit, and make good art. And there have been any number of those. But I always think that that's not to say that it was because they were this meager self, that they poured themselves into art. But I really think of Van Gogh, and I think that it was the lack of the capacity to be loved by anyone else except Theo that in fact hindered, dampened his art and certainly shortened his life. I don't think that Van Gogh in a loving relationship would have made less art, flatter art, thinner, less convicted art. So, let me end this by trying to sew a few things up with what went before. Instruction matters. A systematized, thorough, complete understanding of the human being and our development matters. Materials matters. Al's fantastic motivation when he did the dragon, both fearsome and beautiful. I wanted to stop right there and start drawing. Gee, I can do that, Al. And what also matters, besides that, is this, let's call it this existential environment, this holistic environment, which says that when the teacher brings him or herself, their mindfulnesses, their body awarenesses, and their spiritual convictions to bear upon the design of the curriculum and its pedagogy, and invites those same three elements, those inextricable and basic human elements, by addressing them to each of the students, then that environment, plus instruction, bring about the kind of personhood and its subsequent expression that we seek. Why don't I just stop there? Thank you.